You're not part of this family anymore." My daughter said it with the kind of voice that cuts through air like glass, cracking under pressure, brittle and sharp. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard, because surely no child could look at the woman who gave her breath and declare her disposable. But then I saw her face, tight with contempt, smooth with certainty, and I knew it was not a mistake. It was not a slip. It was the verdict. That sentence has never left me. It circles me even now, echoing at night when the walls hum with the silence of being alone, when the kettle whistles for no one but me, when the air feels heavy with unsaid words. I am 81 years old. I rent a small room in a quiet coastal town, a room with peeling wallpaper and a single wooden chair, and I keep my suitcase half-packed, not because I plan to run away, but because a part of me no longer believes in permanence. But I was not always here. Not always this woman who walks down the promenade unnoticed, who eats her soup slowly in cafes where no one knows her name. Once I stood in the center of a family, or at least I believed I did. Once I was the one who carried the weight of everyone else's comfort, who baked the birthday cakes, who watched the children when sickness came, who made holidays happen even when money was scarce. And yet the woman who stood at the stove for decades was told, with no hesitation, that she was not part of the family anymore, as if belonging were a garment to be stripped off and discarded. It is strange how betrayal rarely announces itself with trumpets. It seeps, it gathers, it coats the air slowly until one day you wake up and realize you have been breathing poison for years. Long before that sentence, there had been signs, of course. Subtle corrections, small exclusions, glances traded between my daughter and her husband as if my presence were a misstep, as if I were an old piece of furniture kept out of guilt rather than need. They had remodeled their kitchen, polished their lives, and polished me out of the picture. At dinners, my opinions were greeted with indulgent smiles, the kind people give a child reciting nonsense, and gradually I learned to keep quiet, to sit still, to fold myself into smaller shapes. It is humiliating how easily silence becomes habit. I told myself I was avoiding conflict, that I was respecting their space, but in truth I was rehearsing absence long before they required it. Still, I clung to my usefulness, because usefulness is the last refuge of the elderly. If I cannot be loved, at least I can be needed. At least I can wash the dishes, walk the dog, pay for the groceries without making a fuss. I thought need would keep me safe. I was wrong. The day she said those words, it was over something so ordinary I can barely recall the details. An argument about the laundry, I think, or about the way I folded the towels. She wanted them rolled, spa-style, lined up like decorative props in a magazine spread. And I had folded them the way I had always done, in squares, sturdy and practical. Meant for use, not for show. A ridiculous thing, but in that moment it became the spark. She looked at me as if the sight of my hands folding cloth was an insult, and then she said it, clear and deliberate. "You're not part of this family anymore." I felt something cave inside me, not like a sudden collapse, but like an old mine shaft giving way after years of strain. My son-in-law stood nearby, and though he did not speak, I remember the way he shifted, uncomfortable, but not defensive, unwilling to contradict her, unwilling to stand beside me. He had always been polite, neutral, careful. In that moment, his silence became another weapon. I left the room without speaking. What could I have said? To beg would have been undignified. To argue would have been pointless. I closed the door behind me, but the echo of her voice followed me down the hallway and into the rest of my life. When people imagine old age, they think of frailty, of slow steps, of trembling hands. But the real fragility is not physical. It is the realization that the bonds you thought unbreakable are in fact made of paper. My daughter was once the child who clung to my skirt when thunder frightened her, who called me my anchor in her teenage diary, who sat beside me during her father's illness and whispered that she did not know how she would survive without me. And yet she survived by casting me aside, as if my years of devotion were nothing but scaffolding to be torn down once the building was complete. That is the cruelty of it. To know that your greatest gift to someone, the entirety of your care, can be rewritten as irrelevance in the script of their life. I am not naive. I know generations clash. I know resentment simmers. I know children carry grievances we never meant to plant. But to hear it so nakedly, without pretense, "You're not part of this family anymore," that is the kind of blow you do not recover from. You simply live around it, like a tree that grows around a wound in its bark. I sit here now, in this little rented room with the sea wind rattling the glass, and I replay it. Not to torture myself, but to trace the path that led here. I remember how, in the weeks before, she had introduced me at a school function not as her mother, but as a family friend visiting for a while. I remember how she rolled her eyes when I insisted on cooking soup instead of ordering takeout. How she smirked when I asked her children about their homework, as if my interest were an intrusion. I remember the way she flinched when I told a neighbor that I had helped them pay for the house deposit years ago, whispering afterward that such details were private, that people would misunderstand. Slowly, without naming it, she erased me. That night at dinner, she asked her husband to carve the chicken, even though for years it had always been me who performed that small ritual. When I reached for the serving spoon, she placed her hand over mine, gently but firmly, and said, "I've got it." And she did have it. All of it. The stage, the narrative, the role of mistress of her house. And in that play, there was no longer a part for me. Do not mistake me. I was not perfect. I have been sharp with my tongue, stubborn with my opinions, unwilling to step aside gracefully when perhaps I should have. But what child can look at a parent and declare them erased? What daughter can spit out the sentence that their own mother is not family? Family is not a club with membership revoked at will. Family is blood, memory, the unspoken understanding that you are tied, whether you like it or not. At least that is what I believed for 8 decades. She taught me otherwise in one breath. I tell you this not to gather sympathy. I am too old for pity, but because it is the hinge on which my life turned. That sentence was not simply rejection. It was exile. And from exile, I began to see myself more clearly, not as a discarded accessory, but as a woman who had been complicit in her own erasure by staying silent too long. So here I am, 81 years old. Alone, yes, but not finished. Wounded, yes, but not broken. The sentence that banished me still burns, but sometimes a burn cauterizes as well as scars. Sometimes being told you are no longer part of a family is the beginning of realizing that you must, at last, belong to yourself. The catalyst came not with thunder, but with paperwork. And that is perhaps the cruelest detail of all, because nothing feels colder than discovering your expulsion from the life you built has already been prepared, signed, filed, and quietly waiting to be revealed. After the night of her declaration, I spent days in a fog, moving about the house with the stunned obedience of someone who has just heard a diagnosis she cannot process, folding laundry that was no longer mine to fold, brewing coffee for a household that had turned its face from me, hoping each day she might soften, that perhaps her words had been born of fatigue or temper. But the softening never came, and instead, one afternoon, she set a stack of envelopes on the table with the brisk efficiency of a secretary, not a daughter, and said, in a tone meant to sound reasonable but sharp enough to cut, "This is for the best." Inside were documents her husband had drafted with the quiet, treacherous patience of someone who had been planning my removal for months. A notice terminating my co-ownership of the house on the basis of a supposed informal understanding. A statement declaring I had contributed nothing financially and was merely residing there out of goodwill, and a suggested agreement by which I would move out within 30 days in exchange for what they dared to call a modest stipend. I remember holding those papers, my eyes tracing words that seemed written in a language I half recognized but could not believe was being used against me, and thinking how strange it was that ink on paper could weigh more than stone. I looked up at my daughter then, searching her face for any flicker of doubt, any tremor of conscience. But her gaze was steady, her chin high, and her hands folded neatly as though she were bracing herself against an elderly patient's resistance. "It's not punishment," she said, as if rehearsed. "But you need your own space, Mom. We need ours. Families change. Families change." I had heard phrases like that from neighbors, from acquaintances discussing divorces or relocations, but to hear it from my own child as justification for banishment was like being told that gravity no longer applied to me, that I could simply be lifted out of orbit without consequence. I wanted to shout that I had paid the down payment, that the deed bore my name, that I had spent years supporting them financially and practically. But in that moment, my tongue felt heavy, as if words themselves refused to defend me, perhaps out of shame that they had been wasted so long in silence. Later that day, after the house had emptied into errands and children's lessons, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the papers spread before me. The sunlight fell across the neat black print, illuminating phrases like voluntary departure and relinquishment of claim. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the rage of recognition. They had not merely spoken cruelty and anger. They had prepared it. They had codified it. They had transformed my existence into a liability to be eliminated with signatures. I thought back to every quiet exclusion, the withheld photographs, the introductions as a guest, the dinners where my contributions went unacknowledged, and realized those were rehearsals for this performance. Betrayal does not arrive suddenly. It arrives with drafts, with discussions, with rehearsed lines. I had been excluded long before I was told so outright. But now it was official. Now it had the authority of ink. I rose from the table and walked to the small cupboard where I kept my own folder of documents, the ones my daughter assumed had been lost to time. There lay the receipts from the transfer I had made when they purchased the house, the bank statement showing my withdrawal of nearly half my savings, the deed itself with my name printed not as an afterthought, but as primary co-owner. I touched the paper gently, running my fingers over the familiar loops of my signature, and for the first time in days, I felt something steadier than despair. Anger, yes, but anger braided with clarity. They had built their case on the assumption of my silence, on the belief that I would be too ashamed or too tired to defend myself, that I would fold as easily as the towels they mocked. In their eyes, I was already erased. That realization did not crush me. It steadied me. That evening, when they returned and asked whether I had read the agreement, I did not shout. I did not cry. I did not beg. I placed their papers back on the table, neat as they had given them, and said only, "I have read them." My daughter nodded quickly, relief flickering in her eyes as if she believed compliance was certain. Her husband adjusted his glasses, waiting for my signature. Instead, I added, quietly but firmly, "I have read them, and I will not be signing anything." Silence flooded the room like water rushing in through a breach, heavy, unstoppable. My daughter's mouth tightened, her husband's face flushed, but I did not move, I did not soften, I did not justify. For once I allowed silence to be my shield, not my prison. That was the true catalyst, not the cruel words spoken in anger, but the attempt to erase me in ink, the effort to reduce decades of labor and sacrifice into a stipend and a signature. Betrayal is not merely being told you are unwanted. It is the revelation that preparations for your absence have already been made, that your life has been measured in square footage and monthly allowances, that those you raised have written your exit while you were still cooking their meals. In that moment, I understood that I was not simply unloved or inconvenient. I was being excised, surgically, as one removes a tumor from a body, and the scar they intended to leave was not theirs, but mine. And yet, holding both sets of papers in my hands, their false narrative and my quiet evidence, I knew the story was not finished. Not yet. The worsening began quietly, the way a storm gathers long before the first thunder is heard, in the hushed, almost invisible shifts of air, in the way the horizon darkens while people still insist it is only a cloud passing. After I refused to sign the agreement, the house altered, not physically but atmospherically, as if my very presence had become a pollutant seeping into their polished environment. My daughter did not scream. She did not confront me directly again. Instead, she withdrew in a manner more devastating than open hostility, a withdrawal that manifested in glances avoided, conversations shortened, silences that no longer felt peaceful but accusatory. Where once I was invited to the dinner table automatically, now I was informed of mealtimes as though it were a favor, an option extended rather than an expectation. Sometimes I would come into the kitchen to find they had already eaten, the dishes washed, the table cleared, and when I asked whether there was anything set aside for me, my daughter would say lightly, "Oh, I thought you weren't hungry. You usually eat less these days." It was presented as absent-mindedness, as oversight, but I knew better. It was the rehearsal of my absence, the training of the family to live without me. The grandchildren, once quick to seek me out for help with homework or for a story before bed, grew strangely formal, their voices pitched with caution, as though they had been instructed that I was fragile or perhaps dangerous. The oldest, who had always called me Nana, began addressing me as Grandma, with a stiffness that did not belong to her, but had been taught. She hesitated before asking me questions, glancing at her mother for approval, and I realized with a sharp pang that even my relationship with them was being quietly rewritten. At family outings, I was no longer told the time of departure until the last moment, and often the car would already be full, a seat conveniently taken, so that I would be left behind with a thin apology. "It will be more comfortable for you at home, Mom. These trips can be tiring." The words were framed as kindness, but they landed as exclusion, stripping me of the right to decide for myself what I could endure. Each day seemed to bring a new way of shrinking me. I noticed photographs disappearing from the living room shelves. The framed picture of me holding my first granddaughter at her baptism. The holiday snapshot of us all in matching scarves. The family portrait where my hand rested on my daughter's shoulder. When I asked casually where they had gone, my daughter claimed she was refreshing the decor, choosing cleaner lines. In their place appeared abstract prints, landscapes devoid of people, images that carried no memory, no warmth. It was a symbolic cleansing, the erasure of my face from their curated environment, and though the walls still stood, I knew I was already being removed from the family's narrative. The financial atmosphere shifted as well. Where once my contributions to groceries and utilities had been expected and accepted without comment, now there was a strange insistence that I need not pay, as though I were already a guest. When I tried to leave money on the counter, my daughter would push it back toward me with a brittle smile and say, "That's not necessary, Mom. You're here for now." For now. The phrase echoed like a verdict. I was no longer part of the structure, merely a temporary fixture, tolerated until arrangements could be completed. Yet at the same time, I overheard hushed conversations about expenses, about the strain of maintaining the house, about opportunities they might have if things were simplified. I understood then that my financial usefulness had expired, that my presence was no longer an asset, but a liability, and that my years of quiet contributions were being rewritten as nothing. There were subtler cruelties, too, the kind one might dismiss as paranoia if not repeated so often. My laundry was sometimes left damp in the machine, mildewing as if forgotten. My favorite mug disappeared, replaced by one with a hairline crack along the rim, as though I were expected to sip carefully, not complain. The small quilt I kept on the sofa was suddenly relegated to a closet because it clashed with the new color scheme. These are small things, trivial to anyone else. But when accumulated, they form the architecture of rejection, each detail reinforcing that my comfort, my preferences, my very presence were unwelcome. The house itself seemed to collude in my exclusion. The new smart devices my son-in-law had installed, the thermostat, the security system, even the digital locks, were explained to everyone except me. I asked once how to adjust the heat, and my daughter responded with a patient but sharp tone. "Don't worry about that, Mom. We'll take care of it." I became a guest in the space I had helped purchase, unable to even control the warmth of the air around me. Once, when I returned from a walk, I found the front door code had been changed without my knowledge. I waited on the porch for nearly an hour until someone came home, and when I asked why, my son-in-law smiled thinly and said it had been a security update. He handed me the new code without apology, but I noticed the hesitation in his eyes, as if he had debated whether to give it to me at all. It was not only the family, but the neighbors too, who began to treat me differently, as if they had been fed a quieter version of the truth. Once, at a neighborhood gathering, a woman asked me cheerfully how long I was visiting. I started to correct her, to say that I lived there, but the glance my daughter shot me silenced me, and I nodded instead, smiling as though the word visitor did not pierce. Later, I realized that this was no accident. This was the narrative being woven that I was a temporary presence, a guest, a dependent drifting through their household rather than a root from which it had grown. The most painful change was within myself. I found my movements becoming hesitant, my voice softer, my laughter stifled. I caught myself apologizing for taking up space in hallways, for using the kitchen at the same time as my daughter, for asking questions about plans. I began to live as if I truly were a guest, tentative, deferential, grateful for scraps of tolerance. I hated myself for it, hated the way I rehearsed absence even while still present. But the atmosphere pressed so heavily that resistance felt like rebellion, and rebellion seemed only to confirm their view of me as difficult, unreasonable, a burden. So I folded myself smaller each day, until one morning I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, shoulders curved, eyes downcast, lips pressed into silence. I thought, with a wave of grief, that they had not only erased me from their family, but were teaching me to erase myself. That was the first escalation, not in raised voices or overt cruelty, but in the tightening web of dismissal, the systematic shrinking of my presence until I questioned my own solidity. The documents on the table had been the declaration, but the days that followed were the execution, a slow suffocation under the guise of civility. It is a terrible thing to realize that one can be made invisible not by violence, but by the steady refusal to see. The shift did not arrive with triumph or clarity, but with a whisper, almost too small to notice, the kind of change you recognize only afterward, when you realize the ground has moved beneath your feet while you were standing still. It happened the morning I awoke before dawn, unable to sleep in the stifling quiet of the house, and decided to take a walk through the neighborhood before anyone else stirred. The air was damp, carrying the faint salt of the nearby sea, and for the first time in months, I felt my lungs expand without resistance. I walked slowly at first, the stiffness of age reminding me of its weight. But then, as I moved past manicured lawns and shuttered windows, I felt an old rhythm return, the steady cadence of my own steps, not dictated by anyone's schedule. By the time I reached the small park at the edge of town, the sun was just beginning to stain the horizon with pale color, and I sat on a bench, listening to the faint rush of traffic in the distance and the first stirrings of birds in the trees. It was a moment of nothing, yet it felt like something enormous, because it was mine, unobserved, unpermitted, unshared. From that morning on, I began to carve small spaces for myself, not rebellions, but quiet reclamations. I went to the library, a place I had not visited in years, and applied for a card with my own name, writing it carefully on the form as though to remind myself it still existed. The librarian, a woman not much younger than my daughter, handed me the card with a polite smile, unaware of the significance of the small rectangle of plastic she placed in my hand. I checked out a single book, an old collection of poems I remembered reading in college, and as I walked home with it tucked against my chest, I felt an odd, almost giddy sense of possession. This was mine. This card. This choice. This act of taking something not for them, but for me. At home, I hid the book in my dresser drawer, not because I feared it would be stolen, but because I wanted it untouched by their disdain, a secret flame I could tend in silence. Soon, I extended these small acts into other corners of my life. I began baking again, not for family dinners or grandchildren's birthdays, but for myself. I bought flour and butter with the cash I kept hidden in my purse and baked a simple cake in the quiet of the afternoon, slicing it carefully and eating a piece with my tea. It was not the cake itself that mattered, but the act of baking without expectation, without performance, without the need for approval. The smell of vanilla filled the kitchen, and though my daughter wrinkled her nose when she came home, saying the scent was overpowering, I did not apologize. I wrapped the rest of the cake in foil and stored it in my room, eating small slices late at night, like a secret communion. Each bite reminding me that I was capable of creating pleasure for myself. I also began to write letters, not to my daughter or her husband, not to anyone who might dismiss or ignore them, but to myself. Each evening, I took a piece of paper and began with "Dear Me," and I wrote whatever I could not say aloud: the anger, the grief, the longing, but also the reminders of who I had been and who I still was. "You are not invisible," I wrote one night, the words trembling but insistent. "You are not erased. You are a woman who worked, who loved, who built, and you do not need their recognition to exist." At first, the letters felt foolish, as though I were play-acting therapy. But gradually, they became a ritual, a lifeline. I folded each one carefully and tucked it into a shoebox under my bed, a private archive of my resistance against silence. It was during this period of small reclamations that I made a decision which marked the true midpoint of my transformation. I rented a room of my own. Not far, only in the next town over. But it was mine, secured with money they did not know I had, signed with my name alone. The room was small and plain, with cracked paint on the walls and a sagging mattress. But when the landlord handed me the key, I felt a surge of strength so sharp it brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in decades, I held a key that did not belong to someone else's house, someone else's rules, someone else's judgments. I did not move out immediately. Fear and habit still tethered me. But I kept that room ready, furnished with a single chair, a kettle, and the book of poems on the nightstand. It became a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe, where I could practice being myself again without the weight of their dismissal pressing on my shoulders. This decision began to change me in ways even they noticed. My daughter remarked one evening that I seemed distracted, and though she said it with suspicion, there was a flicker of unease in her eyes, as though she sensed that the scaffolding of her control was shifting. I no longer rushed to clear the dishes or folded myself into silence when conversations passed me by. I began to answer questions with calm finality, not aggression, but certainty. When she asked me to roll the towels her way, I folded them in squares without explanation. When she suggested I skip a family outing to rest, I replied that I had my own plans, offering no further detail. These were small acts, invisible perhaps to others, but seismic to me, because each one reasserted my autonomy. The truest sign of change came the day I stood before the mirror in my small rented room, trying on a navy wool coat I had bought from a second-hand shop with the first few dollars I earned from sewing alterations for a neighbor. The coat was nothing special, worn at the cuffs, slightly outdated in style. But when I slipped it on and buttoned it to the collar, I felt a jolt of recognition. The woman in the mirror was not the bowed, diminished figure who hovered at the edges of her daughter's household. She was solid, upright, sharp-eyed, someone who had lived and could still live on her own terms. I stood there a long time, running my hand along the fabric, letting the sensation of choice sink into my bones. That was the midpoint, the turning. Not a single event, but the accumulation of small defiances that coalesced into the realization that I had begun to step out of their narrative and into my own. I was no longer waiting to be reinstated, no longer begging for inclusion. I was building a separate rhythm, a life that, though modest and secret, was wholly mine. And with each quiet act, I felt the invisible chains loosen, one by one. The past always has a way of returning, not as a gentle visitor, but as a storm pounding at the doors you thought you had secured. And so it was for me in those months when I had begun to breathe more freely in the quiet sanctuary I had carved for myself. Just as I grew accustomed to my rented room, to the rhythm of my own mornings and the comfort of evenings where I could read without glances judging me, the threads of the life I had tried to escape began to tug at me again, first gently, and then with suffocating force. The first tug was a letter, thin and unassuming, slipped beneath my door by the landlord, who looked at me with a curious expression as he handed it over. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting I recognized instantly, looping and slightly tilted, the handwriting of my grandson Kieran, the boy who once sat beside me for hours painting birdhouses and who had not yet learned how to disguise affection with distance. Inside was a note written quickly, as though he had poured it onto the page without stopping to edit. "Grandma, I don't know where you've gone. Dad says you left without a word. Mom says you needed space. But I don't believe either of them. I've been looking for you. Please let me know you are safe. I miss you." At the bottom was his phone number, underlined twice, as if to anchor his plea. I sat for a long time with that letter in my hands, the words pressing into me like both balm and blade. It was the first acknowledgement that someone had noticed my absence not as a convenience, but as a wound. And yet even as warmth flooded me at the thought of his care, a chill rose when I realized that if he had found a way to reach me, others might not be far behind. For days I carried that letter folded in my pocket, touching it when doubt threatened to smother me. But I did not call him. Not yet. The wound was still too raw, the fear of being pulled back into their orbit too strong. I told myself I needed time, but in truth, I was also testing the strength of my own silence, seeing if I could resist the pull of guilt that had governed me for so many years. The second tug came less kindly, in the form of an official envelope stamped with the emblem of the county court. Inside was a summons. My daughter and her husband were preparing to sell the house, and as my name still appeared on the deed, they required my cooperation. It was not written in those words, of course. The document was filled with legal phrasing and the language of procedure, but beneath it all was the same demand. Yield, disappear. Let us close this chapter without you. I remember the hollow laugh that escaped me when I read it, the absurdity of their attempt to erase me by law after failing to erase me by cruelty. They had underestimated me again, assuming I would be too weary to contest, that I would sign as meekly as they once believed I would fold towels in their preferred style. They did not yet understand that silence does not mean surrender, and patience does not mean passivity. When the court date arrived, I walked into the sterile room with my shoulders squared, wearing the navy coat I had bought secondhand, as though it were armor. My daughter and her husband sat across from me, their lawyer shuffling papers with the smooth detachment of someone paid to turn blood into ink. They looked startled when the clerk read my full name aloud from the deed, his voice echoing in the chamber, acknowledging me as co-owner, not guest, not visitor, but rightful holder of what they had tried to claim alone. I saw my son-in-law's mouth tighten, his jaw working silently as he realized the oversight, and my daughter's eyes flickered with something almost like panic before she smoothed it away behind her usual mask of composure. For a moment, the silence stretched between us like a rope pulled taut, and I felt an unexpected surge of power, not because I had trapped them, but because I had been written back into the narrative they tried to erase. when the lawyer turned to me with practiced politeness and asked if I would be willing to waive my share of the property to streamline the process, I did not raise my voice. I did not offer explanations. I simply said, "No, I will not be waiving anything." The words were simple, but they filled the room with weight, a declaration that could not be softened. My daughter shifted uncomfortably, whispering something to her husband, and for the first time, I watched them react to me, not as a burden to manage, but as an obstacle they could not easily remove. The proceedings dragged on, motions filed and responses demanded, but through it all, I remained steady, buoyed by the knowledge that for once I was not the one shrinking. They were forced to look at me, to reckon with me, to confront the truth they had tried to bury. But even as I found this unexpected strength, the escalation took on new forms, subtle but invasive, as if the past refused to release me without a fight. My daughter began to appear in places she had no reason to be. Once outside the cafe where I sometimes took my breakfast, standing by the pastry case pretending to read the menu, her eyes flicking toward me before turning away. Another time, I saw her across the street, near my rented building, speaking into her phone while watching the doorway, as though waiting for me to emerge. She never approached directly, never spoke. But her presence was enough to rattle me, to remind me that distance is never quite as far as we imagine. And then came the phone calls, unknown numbers that hung up when I answered, voicemails that began with silence before dissolving into muffled voices. I suspected they were hers, or perhaps his, attempts to reach me without admitting vulnerability. But I refused to respond. If they wanted to speak, they could do so openly, not through shadows. The pressure mounted further when I was handed a folded newspaper clipping by a co-worker at the small diner where I had begun to help in the mornings. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch. Family pleads for her return." Beneath it was a photograph of me taken years earlier at a holiday gathering, smiling faintly while holding a pie dish, an image stripped of the context of everything that had followed. The article quoted my daughter, her words dripping with staged concern. "We fear something has happened. She's vulnerable, and we just want her safe." My son-in-law added, "She vanished without a word. We love her dearly and hope she comes home." I laughed when I read it, not a laugh of amusement but of disbelief, sharp and bitter. Vulnerable, they called me, as if I were a lost pet wandering streets, as if my disappearance were not the direct result of their deliberate dismissal. To the world, they painted themselves as grieving children, desperate for their mother's return, while erasing the truth of the airport lounge, the folded towels, the papers thrust across a kitchen table. This public performance of concern was perhaps the cruelest escalation of all, because it weaponized narrative itself, turning me into a character in their story once again, a fragile old woman who had wandered off, rather than a woman who had chosen to leave. Strangers now looked at me differently when they recognized the photograph, their gazes tinged with pity, and I realized that my daughter's control extended beyond the walls of her home into the wider perception of community. She was rewriting me not only for herself, but for the world, and I had to decide whether to counter that narrative or let it collapse under the weight of its own falsity. For now, I chose silence, not out of fear, but out of refusal to play her game. Yet not all echoes of the past were poison. Kieran's letter remained tucked in my drawer, and eventually, after weeks of turning it over in my hands, I dialed the number he had scrawled at the bottom. When he answered and said, Grandma?" with a tremor in his voice. I felt something break open inside me. We spoke quietly, cautiously, as though afraid of being overheard by ghosts. But his words were simple. He missed me. He wanted to see me. He did not believe the stories being told about me. That single conversation became a thread of light in the suffocating weave of betrayal, proof that not all ties had been severed, that one bond remained uncorrupted. It was not reconciliation with the family I had lost, but it was connection, a lifeline, and it reminded me that the escalation of pressure did not mean I was entirely alone. The second escalation, then, was not a single confrontation, but a symphony of returning pressures. The legal summons, the staged sightings, the newspaper pleas, the phone calls, the twisting of public perception, all converging to test whether the fragile independence I had begun to cultivate could withstand the weight of their attempts to pull me back. And though I trembled at times, though I wept in my small rented room when the voices of memory grew too loud, I did not break. I held to my key, to my coat, to my letters, to my own name spoken aloud in a courtroom, and I began to believe that perhaps survival was not only possible, but inevitable. For the first time in years, I did not ask whether I was strong enough to endure. I knew that I was, because I already had. The culmination of all those months, all those whispered dismissals and open erasures, arrived not with a scream, but with the sound of my own voice in a courtroom, steady, unwavering, claiming what had been denied to me. By the time the final hearing was scheduled, I had rehearsed the words so many nights alone in my small rented room that they no longer sounded fragile or tentative. They had become a shield, a shape of truth I could stand behind. I remember walking into the courthouse that morning with my navy coat buttoned tight, the shoebox of letters I had written to myself still resting beneath my bed at home, like a secret chorus of encouragement, and the faint smell of baked bread clinging to me from the cake I had made the night before as a kind of ritual offering to my own strength. The air inside the courthouse was cold, recycled, indifferent. But I carried with me the heat of certainty, and for once it was enough. My daughter and her husband sat across the aisle, their lawyer beside them, shuffling papers as if shuffling fate. But I did not look away when their eyes met mine. For the first time since that night in the kitchen when she declared me not part of this family anymore, I did not lower my gaze or retreat into silence. Instead, I let my eyes rest on her face with a calm that unnerved even me, a calm born not of forgiveness, but of the refusal to be erased again. When the judge asked if there were any statements before proceeding with the division of property, my daughter's lawyer spoke first, weaving a tale of misunderstanding, of my supposed instability, of my gracious decision to step aside that had been misfiled and now needed to be formalized. His words dripped with condescension, crafted to make me sound like a confused old woman who had simply lost track of her own intentions. He finished with a perfunctory smile, confident, as though the case were already settled, as though my silence could be relied upon. But then the judge turned to me, and in that moment, I felt every year of my life gather inside me, not as weight, but as grounding. I rose slowly, not for dramatic effect, but because my knees required it, and when I spoke, my voice did not tremble. "I will not be relinquishing my claim," I said. The words echoed in the chamber, and though they were simple, they carried decades of unsaid resistance. I explained calmly that I had contributed nearly half the deposit when the house was purchased, that I had lived there not as a guest but as a co-owner, that the narrative of my supposed departure was a fabrication. I produced receipts, bank statements, and the original deed with my name intact. My daughter shifted in her seat. Her husband's face flushed deep red, but I did not let my eyes leave the judge. "I have been treated as though I do not exist," I said, my voice firmer now. "But I do exist. My name is here. My life is here, and I will not allow it to be erased." There was silence after I spoke, the kind of silence that feels like air has thickened, when everyone present realizes the script has changed. The judge nodded slowly, reviewing the documents, and for the first time I saw recognition flicker across his face. Not pity, but respect. My daughter's lawyer attempted to object, to reframe my words as confusion, but his voice wavered, his certainty fractured by the steadiness of my refusal. It was in that moment, more than any, that I knew I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. I was no longer the woman rehearsing silence in hallways or folding herself into smaller shapes at dinner tables. I was the woman whose name had been read aloud, whose voice now carried into official record, whose truth could not be folded away. The decision did not come immediately, of course. Courts move slowly, grinding human lives into procedural dust. But the effect of my words was instant. My daughter would not meet my eyes as the session ended. Her husband gathered the papers with jerky motions, and their lawyer avoided me altogether. I walked out of that courthouse alone, but not diminished. For the first time in years, I felt taller, as though the very act of reclaiming my name had straightened my spine. Outside, the air smelled of rain, the sky heavy with unshed storms. But I lifted my face to it, unafraid of being drenched. I thought of all the times I had been told, in words or in silence, that I was not part of the family, not part of the picture, not part of the plan. And I realized that the truest act of belonging is not in being included, but in refusing to vanish. In the weeks that followed, the formal outcome was settled. I was awarded my rightful share of the property sale, a sum that, while not extravagant, represented validation, recognition, proof that my years of contribution had not been erased entirely. I deposited the money into an account in my own name, another small but potent act of autonomy. Yet, even as I held those numbers on a bank statement, what mattered most was not the money itself, but the knowledge that I had spoken, that I had inscribed myself back into the story they had tried to rewrite without me. It was irreversible, not because of the financial outcome, but because I had crossed the invisible line from silence to assertion, from erasure to existence. That act, the refusal to wave, the refusal to vanish, was my climax, my point of no return. For the rest of my life, whether short or long, I would know that I had not gone quietly, that I had not allowed even my own daughter to reduce me to nothing. In reclaiming my place, I did not restore the family I had lost. That wound would remain, perhaps forever. But I restored myself to myself, and that was a victory no one could take. Peace, when it finally came, did not arrive like a sudden light breaking through clouds. It came gradually, like the tide returning after a long and violent storm, slow, patient, insistent, shaping the shoreline anew. After the courtroom, after the final documents were signed, and my share of the house became more than just a number on a page, but a reality in my possession, I found myself sitting in my small, rented room with the knowledge that I had crossed the line into a different life. At first, the silence there seemed too wide, almost unbearable, because for so long I had filled silence with the weight of others, their needs, their conversations, their dismissals. And now there was nothing but my own breath and the ticking of a clock on the wall. Yet slowly I began to feel that silence shift, no longer hostile, no longer accusing, but spacious, as though it belonged to me at last. I used part of the money to secure a modest apartment overlooking the sea. Nothing grand, but with wide windows and enough light to make the mornings bright. I furnished it simply, with a sturdy table, a comfortable chair, a bed that did not sag, and shelves that I slowly filled with books from the library and the second-hand shop. Each object I chose deliberately, not inherited, not imposed, not carried from someone else's narrative, but mine, marked by my hand and my decision. I even bought a new set of dishes, plain white porcelain, nothing ornate. But every morning when I placed my cup of tea on the saucer, I felt the solidity of belonging, the quiet reassurance that no one could call me guest here. It was in this space that the letter from my granddaughter arrived, written in round, uneven handwriting, her words spilling over the edges of the page as if she had too much to say for the lines to contain. She told me she missed me, that she didn't understand why I was gone, that she wanted to visit, and that she still thought of me when she played the piano, because I had been the one who first sat with her as she stumbled through scales. I held that letter to my chest and felt tears slip down my face, not tears of sorrow alone, but of recognition, because here was proof that not all ties had been severed, that the thread of love could stretch beyond the cuts her mother had tried to make. I did not rush to respond. I took my time, writing carefully, telling her that I missed her too, that I was safe, that one day soon we would see each other, that she should keep playing, because music would carry her through loneliness just as words carried me. When I sealed the envelope and placed it in the post, I felt as though I had placed a stone on the foundation of something new, fragile perhaps, but strong enough to hold. My days became marked by simple rituals that no one could strip from me. I walked by the sea every morning, letting the salt air sting my lungs, reminding myself with each step that I was still alive, that the world did not end with betrayal. I baked in the afternoons, sometimes bread, sometimes cakes, filling the apartment with the warmth of creation, and I shared what I made with the women in the shelter down the street. Women who, like me, had been pushed aside by families, by husbands, by children who forgot that mothers are not furniture to be discarded. In their eyes I saw a recognition, a quiet sisterhood, and in giving to them I felt myself expanding, not shrinking. It was not revenge, it was not bitterness, it was simply connection, the antidote to erasure. At night, I continued to write my letters, no longer desperate confessions, but reflections, reminders, small fragments of wisdom I wanted to leave for myself, and perhaps for the granddaughter who would one day read them. "You can forget me," I wrote in one, "but I remember me now." Those words became a refrain, a vow I whispered to myself whenever doubt crept in, whenever the echo of my daughter's cold voice tried to reassert itself. I was no longer bound by her verdict. I was my own witness, my own jury, my own advocate, and that was enough. Sometimes, as I sat by the window, watching the sea change color with the shifting light, I thought of my daughter, and though pain still rose, it no longer consumed me. I understood now that her rejection was not the end of me. It was the unveiling of her, and that difference mattered. I no longer longed for reconciliation that would erase the truth. I only wished her the clarity to see what she had done, not for my sake, but for hers. If that clarity never came, I would still be here, intact, unvanished. The resolution of my story was not the restoration of what I had lost, but the discovery that I could live whole without it. I had thought once that family was the soil from which I grew, but I learned that I was the soil myself, and that I could root again even in barren ground. Betrayal had scarred me, yes, but it had also revealed to me the strength of my own endurance. That is the quiet truth of survival. It does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives with the sound of your own breath in an empty room, steady, unbroken, still yours. And so I sit here now, 81 years old, with a cup of tea on my white porcelain saucer, the sea murmuring beyond the window, the letter from my granddaughter folded neatly beside me, and I know that while my daughter may have declared me no longer part of her family, I have declared myself part of something larger, a lineage of women who refuse to be erased. To any woman who finds herself in the silence of rejection, I say this: you can survive, you can build, you can remember yourself even when others forget. We are not finished until we decide we are, and I, for one, have decided otherwise.